Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you and to try to make sense of the kind of horrendous times that we are going through. It's also particularly important, I think, to have these opportunities to come together, to discuss, debate, disagree, make sense of the world around us at the time where I think that's been made extremely difficult, both in the kind of political sphere where we are being sort of admonished and demanded to not historicize, not understand the current moment in its historical context, as well as in a institutional setting where I think all of us, whether it be at Basel or in Leiden, are facing a whole number of institutional barriers, hoops, attempts at shutting down the possibility of discussion and debate. And I think, particularly in universities, of course, one would be forgiven to raise a particularly high eyebrow in the face of such policies, but of course, a much wider problem across society. So in that spirit, I'm particularly thankful to the organizers for putting this event together and for the kind of effort and energy that it takes not only to set something like this up, but also to deal with all the institutional barriers put in front of us. That being said, my talk today, which I hope will be a bit shorter than an hour, although I don't have very good form with timekeeping. I will do my best. Is going to focus on, or is going to use as its entry point, this question of the creation of the Gaza Strip. What is the Gaza Strip? And how does it relate to wider questions within Zionism and the debates that, as I will try to show, start really from the late 19th century onwards on what to do with the Palestinians if a new state, which is understood very self-consciously by the Zionist movement as a colonial state, as a colonial project, and again, I'll talk a little bit about that. What then to do with the population that is already there? And the reason that I want to do this is not only to put the current moment in its, I think, appropriate historical context, but also to understand how this thing that we call the Gaza Strip, in a sort of unthinking way almost, emerges, and why it represents, as I'll try to argue, the outcome of long-term attempts by the Zionist movement and then the Israeli state to resolve this contradiction of building a state over a kind of an existing, and in the place of an existing society and an existing people. So this is the kind of the question I want to ask is, what is the Gaza Strip? And how does answering that question allow us to make sense both of the 7th of October, as well as the genocidal assault that is currently playing itself out in Gaza in front of the entire world, and what I think is a close to unsolvable strategic problem for Israel's settler-colonial project in Palestine. Now, I'll come back to that at the end, but I think it's partly, it's important to make sense of that if we are to understand the kind of the current genocidal bloodletting that is taking place with close to no, if any, kind of actual military goals. I don't think that's actually what's on the table here, and that there's a much more kind of fundamental attempt at dealing with this so-called Palestinian question. So I start with this image that I think everybody will be familiar with, which is the kind of the slow movement from the beginning of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th century, No, the beginning of the 20th to the beginning of the 21st century, and this kind of transformation of Palestine as a part of the Ottoman Empire, then a so-called British mandate, the beginning of Zionist settlement in Palestine until just before the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, where 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed of the lands that were to become the Israeli state, the UN partition plan proposed in 1947, the end of the Nakba and the division in what we today call the 1967 borders, should perhaps be called the 1949 borders, and then the kind of occupation of the whole of historic Palestine in 1967, and the current kind of breaking up of Palestinian land and these kind of disconnected islands. And hopefully what should immediately become clear is that what we call the Gaza Strip is neither a sort of a natural or objective geographic entity, as it might be presented, often or even sometimes as a quasi-independent state. If you follow some of the news, you'd be forgiven to think that it's a sort of an independent a state with its own kind of borders and state-like institutions. But instead is the outcome, the idea of the Gaza Strip of 75 years of Israeli policy that focused broadly on concentrating Palestinians in as little land as possible. And I think this kind of map brings that home very well, which is that even in terms of how we might think about what we are looking here, clearly this idea of a Gaza Strip is something that until partition and until the Nakba is something that makes fairly little sense. And I'll come back to what then is Gaza before then. But to understand this, I think it's important to make sense of the kind of the history of the Zionist movement and how the Zionist movement understood itself and how it understood its relationship with the Palestinian people. And I think this is important because today it has become a very disputed question whether or not Zionism and then the Israeli state are a settler-colonial project and state, respectively, or not. Not so at the founding moments of the Zionist movement and the Israeli state, and in fact until fairly late. So you'll find quite a lot of Israeli kind of produced material well into the late 1950s, early 1960s, in which the Israeli state will discuss its own efforts within its own borders, so within the borders of the newly state as colonial. And there's lots of kind of different examples of that we can talk about, but it's really with the kind of wave of decolonization in the 1960s and then 70s that a turn is going to be operated and where Israel is going to stop to describe itself as such. And this is important, I think, because it tells us something about the nature of the Zionist movement, which is a profoundly European movement. So on the one hand, it's a movement that emerges within a kind of highly assimilated European Jewish intelligentsia, often in Western and Central Europe, later in Eastern Europe as well, who will see the kind of the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe in the second half of the 19th century as an outcome of the kind of emergence of the nation state, which will kind of posit this idea that the state and the nation should be directly representative of each other, and therefore will repeatedly define Jewish populations in Europe as sitting outside of it for ethnic, religious, linguistic reasons. There's going to be a whole number of responses to that. I don't have the time to go into them. We can discuss them in the discussion. But broadly speaking, there are four. One is religious, which will call on Jewish populations to suffer the realities of this world. There will be one which is probably the most popular amongst the Jewish population, certainly in Eastern Europe, which is going to be emigration to North America primarily, which is There's very large Jewish population in North America with Eastern European and Central European roots. There will be a response which will be revolutionary in many ways. So a lot of people will be familiar with the fact that Jews were overrepresented in labor movements, communist movements, socialist movements, anarchist movements, etc., in European history from the late 19th century up until the Holocaust. And a fourth, which for a very long time, really until the rise of fascism in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and the closing of American and British borders to Jewish migration at the same time. Until then, Zionism will remain a real minority kind of response to anti-Semitism. And the argument of the Zionist movement is going to be threefold. One, it's going to say anti-Semitism is unresolvable in Europe. Two, anti-Semitism emerges out of the creation of the state, of the nation state, which promises each nation to receive a state. And three, we should therefore, as a Jewish people, develop our own state, which we will develop as a colonial state. And this is a self-avowed, accepted kind of political position. And I think that shouldn't surprise us in the sense that the Zionist thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century were European intellectuals. And like other European intellectuals, they saw it as normal to solve the internal European problems through expansion in the rest of the world. And the idea was that the Jewish nation, as the Zionists understood it, in a sort of mirror image of European anti-Semitism, will enter the kind of European family of nations through this process of colonization. And so there are many examples. A very striking one, of course, is Theodor Herzl, who is going to be one of the early theoreticians of the Zionist movement, but importantly also one of its sort of political and practical architects. He's going to push for the foundation of the Zionist organization in 1897 and very actively campaign for colonial powers to support the Zionist movement. And he's going to do so broadly on kind of two axes. On the one hand, he will say Palestine is a important strategic location in the world economy. It still is. It's at the crossing of three continents. In the early 20th century, it was the end point of the new pipelines that were being built to pull oil out of what is today northern Iraq into the Mediterranean. And it finds itself on one side of the Suez Canal, which remains until today the most important thoroughfare of world trade. And so that's going to be argument number one, is that the different colonial powers will have an interest in this kind of crucial strategic point. And two, that these powers were deeply anti-Semitic. And so the kind of argument that the Zionist movement will make to these powers is to say, you don't want the Jews in Europe. We have a solution for you, which is a double solution. It's both ridding yourself of a Jewish population, and it is strengthening European power in what is at the time the crumbling Ottoman Empire. You can think of a number of different examples of that. The most striking is probably Lord Balfour. You might know that the letter in which the British government expresses its support for the Zionist movement is called the Balfour Declaration, after the name of Arthur Balfour, who's a British minister at the time and who was a virulent anti-Semite. He wrote the 1905 Aliens Act, which is the first British law targeting Jewish migrants running from the pogroms in Eastern Europe and trying to find refuge in Britain and trying to limit their numbers. And so Balfour, as many other in the British government, will see Zionism as a kind of a solution to this. I've selected two. There are many other quotes from The Jewish State, the book that Theodor Herzl wrote, that I think capture this idea that the project is understood both as colonial on the one hand and very much as part of, and so this very famous sentence where Herzl says, we should there, so in Palestine, form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. And you can think sort of, this is in the late 19th century, how much of that sentiment, how much of that sentence remain really at the heart of how we might understand Zionism, the Israeli state, its relationship with the region around it, and its relationship with Western powers. Similarly, the previous quote, I won't read the whole of it. It's been up for a long time. I assume people have looked at it, but is this question that it's not sufficient to migrate, to sort of slowly move to Palestine, but that it needs to be done under the colonial protection of one of the great powers that can impose it militarily on the indigenous population. It's interesting to see that Herzl still talks about Palestine and Argentina. Other countries will be floated very early on at the first conference of the Zionist movement in 97. The question of Palestine becomes central. I'm not going to go into that. If there's questions, we can return to it. But all of that to say that there's a real kind of understanding of the project of Zionism by itself as a European colonial project in the Middle East. Now, that is one thing, which is to say that that's the project. The other question, and the one that interests us more today, is what that means for the so-called Palestine question, or the Palestinian question, of what to do with the Palestinians. Because while the kind of mythology of the Zionist movement is very much in this idea that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, as the slogan had it, the Zionist movement was, of course, immediately aware of the fact that there was, in fact, a people in the land and a rather thriving society. There's a famous story of two emissaries that are sent to Palestine and who write back to the Zionist organization to say the bride, we have seen the bride, she's beautiful, but she is married to another man. The idea being that they've seen Palestine, that Palestine is a sort of a wonderful place, but that there are already people there. Of course, the Zionist movement also immediately worked to develop settlements in Palestine, again, very obviously as a colonial project. Their bank to finance the project was called the Palestine Colonial Bank, as one example amongst others. The question, therefore, became what to do with the Palestinians. And really, there are sort of two wings, broadly speaking. There's more, but there's broadly two wings that develop in the Zionist movement. One that we might think of as the bourgeois wing of the Zionist movement, which will look, for example, at Algeria and at earlier in the 19th century German settlement in Poland. And they will say that, like in Algeria, for example, what should happen in Palestine is that a minority of Jewish landlords should own land on which a majority of indigenous Palestinian workers would be exploited in order to generate cash crops for export to Europe. So really the kind of French North African colonial model. Against that, a different wing, which is usually called the labor Zionist movement, is going to develop and become very influential. And they are going to make a double argument. The first argument they're going to make is they're going to say that model is a strategic catastrophe. And they're going to talk very openly. And again, it's interesting is that the examples being used in those debates are of other settler colonies. So again, the kind of the Zionist movement is aware of itself. And the theoreticians of the labor Zionist movement are going to talk about South Africa. And they're going to say, look at South Africa, where a minority of white landlords exploit a majority of Black African workers. And it's a catastrophe because those indigenous workers keep rebelling. They keep revolting, they keep going on strike, they keep fighting back. This is no way of building a stable and effective colonial economy, we have to avoid this at all costs. The second argument that they're going to make is that this is also the only way to attract Jews from Europe. Like I've said, the majority responses in the Jewish community in Europe are not Zionism. They are bearing religiously the oppression in Europe. They are fighting back in the kind of developing labor and revolutionary movements of the period, and they are emigrating largely to North America, but also to Britain in fairly important numbers. And so the labor Zionist movement is going to say the only way to make the state effective is to make it a state that is not dependent on indigenous labor. We therefore have to become a majority in Palestine. If we are to become a majority in Palestine, we have to develop an economy that is attractive enough to Jewish workers in Europe, because we can't only attract wealthy settlers who can own land and exploit indigenous populations. We actually have to attract people who can make a whole country and a whole economy function. And out of that is going to emerge a movement that is known as the movement for Hebrew labor, or the conquest of labor. And the idea is going to be that the economy needs to become a Jewish economy, as they theorize it, which means separate from the existing Palestinian population. So it's a movement that's going to oppose itself both to the Jewish landlords, saying like, you want to hire and exploit Palestinians and pay them less than you would pay us, and by doing that you are driving down our wages. And it's going to fight Palestinian workers by saying you are occupying our jobs and driving down our wages. And so the kind of emerging institutions of the labor movement, which are going to remain very important institutions in the history of Zionism, the kibbutzim, these kind of collective farms that you might have heard of, that are often sort of represented as socialist paradises in which workers had kind of control over land and production. Many lefties in Europe and North America went to the kibbutzim in the 60s and 70s. And of course, that was partly true. They were collectively controlled and run, but on the basis that they had done away with both of the opponents of the labor Zionist movement. Bosses, on the one hand, who wanted to hire cheaper Palestinians, and Palestinian workers, who were seen both as an economic and a political threat, given they would bring down wages and they would destabilize the future state. The Histadrut, which is the largest trade union federation, still is the largest trade union federation in Israel today, which we can talk about it more. I don't have time, but sort of played a kind of historians have described it as a state in waiting. It had a central bank. It had a building, a company. Up until the 1990s, it employed 20% of the Israeli labor force, generated 25% of its GDP. Sorry, that's the other way around. 20% of its GDP, 25% of its labor force. So it didn't quite function as a trade union, but it was a trade union federation, in name at least, that was set up to fight for this campaign of Hebrew labor in 1920. The Haganah, which was a militia that was set up to protect the kibbutzim from Palestinians who might want to return to the land, an important question to which I will return, and that formed the backbone of the Israeli army. But so these important institutions emerged out of this process of the campaign for Hebrew labor, which is this campaign for the exclusion of Palestinians out of the future state rather than their exploitation. You see here a poster that says "Towards the Galilee" in the north of historic Palestine, and you see here a kind of the model vision of a participant in the labor in the labor Zionist movement that works the land and defends it. But so this question is really important, because I think it lays the foundation to understand the Nakba. Because it is not true that all colonial economies are established through ethnic cleansing or to the expulsion of the indigenous population. In fact, it's not even true that all settler colonies are established that way. Of course, they always conquer land and establish their control over the most strategically and economically viable and important land. But if you think of Algeria and South Africa that I've already mentioned, the economy was constructed on the basis of exploiting rather than excluding or expelling the indigenous population. Not so in the case of the Zionist movement and the Israeli state, which establishes itself in a war of aggression between 1947 and 1949. And it's important to start in 1947 because official historiography in Israel often starts in 1948 and says the state is declared and then Israel is attacked. What that doesn't talk about is that the expulsion of Palestinians and the destruction of their villages and their in their urban centers by the Zionist militias, most importantly the Haganah that I just mentioned, started in 1947. So it starts before the creation of the state. And in the Nakba, 750,000, between 7 and 800, depending on the numbers you follow. I've settled for 750. Palestinians are kicked out, which is 3/4 of the total number of Palestinians in the borders of what becomes the Israeli state. And this really, I think, can only be understood in the kind of longer political and intellectual tradition of this campaign for Hebrew labor. It's an aggressive campaign of dispossession. What do you call it? It's not assumption, but I've forgotten the word. So it's not an exact calculation, but the kind of the close calculation at the time is that 330 million American dollars, which would be more or less $10 billion in 2002, were dispossessed in land, buildings, businesses, and wealth of those 750,000 Palestinians that were expelled in 1948. The kibbutzim, the collective farms that I've just talked about, saw their ownership of land quadruple between 1947 and 1952. So after Palestinians were kicked out of the land was redistributed, and the kibbutz played a really important role in that. And that's going to be important to think about what happens to Gaza and its periphery. The Palestinians who remain within the state are put under military rule, and that's going to continue until the mid-1960s, in which Palestinians will not be able to leave the areas, largely in the north and in the south, of the new Israeli state without express military permission, something that we then see again in the West Bank and Gaza later on. The Histadrut, the Israeli trade union, sits on the committee that controls that administers the military rule and controls the granting and taking away of labor permits, which allow Palestinians to leave the areas in which they are stuck under military rule in order to go work in the Israeli economy, but always in limited and controlled ways. And so the idea is that when there were labor shortages that couldn't be filled by the Israeli populations, more labor permits could be distributed to allow the Palestinians to fill those shortages. And when there were enough Israelis, the labor permits could be taken back to close the tap, as it were. Something, again, that we're going to see both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip after 1967. So this is the first moment in which there is an attempt at dealing with the contradiction in the Zionist movement between wanting to control more land and to diminish as much as possible the amount of Palestinians that inhabit that land. And so it's through expulsion on the one hand and through tight kind of military control over the Palestinians that remained on the other. And I think it's useful to understand in this general kind of debate between exploitation and expulsion in the Zionist movement, and the victory in that kind of struggle through the building of the institutions I mentioned of the labor Zionist movement. Now, why is that relevant to the Gaza Strip? Because what we think of today as Gaza, or as the Gaza Strip, is really an outcome of this of this process. If I return back to my first image, here you see it really strikingly is that it's an outcome of a military campaign that conquers very large amounts of historic Palestine between 1947 and 1949 and leaves a small area, even smaller than the area that the UN partition plan had envisaged to become the Gaza Strip. And so that the geographic area is already the outcome of war making. Now that strip is going to move in all sorts of ways, as you can see here, I think on a map that captures some of the kind of differences that are not captured as well on the previous map I just showed. But what remains true is that Gaza is cut from its wider social world. It is cut from trade routes, including to the Hijaz, including to the north and the rest of the Middle East. It is cut from its villages, from its agricultural surroundings, which in fact have been cleansed. So villages have been destroyed, Palestinian populations and urban centers in the north of Gaza and the kind of agricultural areas surrounding the city. And 200,000 refugees, which is a little bit less than a third, between a third and a quarter. Sorry, a little bit more than a third and a little bit less than a quarter of the Palestinians who are expelled in 1948 end up in this new area, which is called the Gaza Strip, which is this kind of Gaza City and the areas around it, including smaller town and agricultural areas. And so an area that had 80,000 people in it is turned into really a concentration of Palestinians. 200,000 refugees are pushed into Gaza, which is still a reality today. 77% of the population in Gaza are refugees from the Nakba. And so really, I think to think of the Gaza Strip is from the very beginning to think of a process of concentrating the Palestinians, as many Palestinians as possible, in as little a geographic space as possible. Until 1967, the Gaza Strip is going to be under Egyptian supervision. It wasn't officially Egyptian rule, but basically Egyptian rule. After 1967, Israel is going to conquer the whole of historic Palestine, as well as the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert that you can see here on your third map. And so the Gaza Strip is going to be part of a new kind of occupied territory that will be settled both inside of Gaza and in the Sinai by religious settler movements. The Sinai will be returned to Egypt in the 79 peace accords with Egypt, and then Gaza. The Gaza Strip is going to be, for the first time, as it were, entirely cut off from the rest of the world, like the West Bank after 1967. It is integrated into Israeli rule, and then as Israeli rule retreats in 1979, Gaza is the last part of the south that remains under Israeli rule. The question immediately, if Gaza is this technology to concentrate Palestinians, is going to be how to keep them there, how to stop or to push them out, but how to stop them from returning to their land. And that's not only a question for Gaza, it's going to be a question for the refugee populations in the north, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the east, in Jordan. And the question is going to be how to both control the land, so how to develop infrastructure that can hold the land from which Palestinians have been kicked out, as well as how to militarily control it in a way that stops Palestinians from trying to come back. And there are two important aspects to this. The first one is going to be the construction of military outposts that are going to turn into kibbutzim, so these collective farms that I've already mentioned around Gaza, that are going to control the land and have military brigades whose role will be to stop Palestinians from returning. Nahal Oz, which people will have heard the name of a lot since it was attacked on October the 7th. Nahal Oz is one of those military outposts that becomes a kibbutz, and Nahal is the name of the military unit that founded it, and it founded a number of these military outposts turned into agricultural outposts. The role of these kibbutzim was therefore, as I said, both to occupy the land and stops Palestinians from returning, and they had these units of kibbutzniks that were trained militarily and whose role it was to stop Palestinians from returning. There's a very famous moment in Israeli history that is sort of remembered and taught to Israeli students, which is the killing of Roy Rothberg, who was the head of one of those military units in Nahal Oz in 1956, by a group of Fedayeen of Palestinian fighters from the Gaza Strip in one of these clashes around between the Palestinian refugees in Gaza and these Israeli outposts. Rothberg is killed, and Moshe Dayan, that people might know, who's an important figure of labor Zionism, he's a military officer. He later becomes a minister, famous for having the eye patch, for those of you who don't recognize the name, was in Nahal Oz at the time of the murder of Rothberg, and gives a very famous speech about the gates of Gaza. For those of you who are less familiar with your Bible studies, the gates of Gaza is a biblical term related to the story of Samson, who pulls out the gates of Gaza and throws them away. This is also where my Bible knowledge falters. I can't remember the whole story, but so it has this sort of biblical connotation. And Dayan very famously, in a short eulogy that all Israeli students will learn, famously says at the funeral of Rothberg, "Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years they sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and saw in front of their eyes how we turned the lands and the villages in which they and their forefathers once dwelled into our homeland. Not from the Arabs of Gaza must we demand the blood of Roy, but from ourselves." Now, what Dayan meant by that was not our conquest and ethnic cleansing of Palestine was wrong and we should allow the refugees to return. What he was saying is we got too comfortable, we got too confident, and we have to remain a military society that can guard the border or the frontier in order to stop the kind of the return of the Palestinians. So the kind of the gates of Gaza speech becomes very famous and is extraordinarily relevant, both in terms of the geography, the developments, the conflict, the military nature of the conflict, etc., that we might think of in terms of thinking about October 7th. And this is in 1965. It's also interesting to, again, think about this difference in self-representation within Israel and the Zionist movement in the past and today. The kind of extraordinary candor of Israeli officials is always always striking in terms of reading historical documents. The second aspect of the kind of surrounding of Gaza, and again, this is not just about Gaza, as you see on the map, we can also think about that in terms of the West Bank, in terms of the border with Lebanon, etc., are the so-called developmental towns. Developmental towns were towns that emerged out of what were called integration camps, the Ma'abarot, which were these camps where Mizrahi Jews, so Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, who arrived after 1948, both willingly through expulsion, through recruitment by the Zionist movement, out of North Africa and the Middle East in Israel, and were first put into these integration camps. And many of those integration camps became sort of peripheral industrial centers that were known as developmental towns. And the developmental towns, which you see in the white squares on this map, were cities or towns far away from the kind of main centers of Israeli life: Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and occupied the land out of which Palestinians had been kicked out. And it was both a way to keep these Jews from North Africa and the Middle East far away from the kind of Ashkenazi center of the country, to have them play an economic role, because heavy industry or heavier industry was located in those towns, and to play, again, as the kibbutzes had, a role that was not only economic, but also military, in terms of keeping the border and the areas. And you can sort of see where those developmental towns are located. And again, Ashkelon and Sderot, which were attacked on the 7th of October, alongside other places like Ofakim, for example, where some of those developmental towns that were built surrounding Gaza. And so when the populations in Israel today, in both those cities and those kibbutzim, say that the Israeli government doesn't care about them, that it left them to be attacked and to die, etc., I think it partly captures something which is real, which is that this is the role that they occupy in Israeli state making, which is literally putting them by the border as a kind of I don't know what words to use, as a barrier, let's say, because of course, you know, there is a real barrier as well, but as a barrier built around the Strip, and that starts immediately after the Nakba. And so you can see that the current moment has these very long historical trajectories, both in terms of the areas and the people at play, as well as the process of concentrating Palestinians, which of course we're very familiar with inside of the Gaza, of what becomes the Gaza Strip, as this place of concentration. As I had warned myself, I'm doing much worse for time than I had hoped, so I'll try to do this a little bit quicker. But 1967, which you'll be familiar with as the moment in which the whole of historic Palestine is conquered and occupied by Israel, as well as the Sinai Desert and the Golan Heights, as I showed on the earlier map, reopens the contradiction of Zionism that I mentioned, which the Nakba was supposed to resolve, and which I think remains the central contradiction in Israeli politics today, which is that from 1967 onwards, more land has meant more Palestinians. Israel conquered the whole of historic Palestine, but didn't do so on the basis of an expulsion that is comparable to that of 1948. There was expulsion, 300,000 Palestinians were expelled, but often also internally, people didn't leave in the same way because they knew, unlike in 1948, that they wouldn't be able to come back, etc. And so from 1967, Israel deals with the old contradiction, which it had tried to deal with in the past, in a much more powerful way. And in that process, Gaza emerges really as a particular issue. As I've said, it's a very small amount of land. It's, if I'm not mistaken, 395 square kilometers. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 395 or 365. I have both in my head, but I think it's 395 square kilometers. In which today 2.3 million people live. It's not 2.3 million in 1967. Somebody can ask Google how many were at the time, but a very large amount of Palestinians, I should have written it down, but I didn't, are concentrated, as I showed, from 1948, over a third of those expelled in Gaza, and now Gaza is again under Israeli rule. So the very logic of expelling them is being counteracted by this new integration. Levi Eshkol, who's the Israeli prime minister at the time, muses that perhaps if we don't give them enough water, they won't have a choice but to leave by themselves. So this kind of cutting of water as a military strategy has kind of longer intellectual roots in kind of Israeli policy making, or at least in the kind of imagination of Israeli policymakers. What happens in 67 is that before 1967, there are huge labor shortages in the Israeli economy, which can no longer be fulfilled by bringing in Jews from the Middle East and North Africa as they had in 1948. And so Palestinians are increasingly integrated into the Israeli economy. This is striking because, as I mentioned, the whole logic of the expulsion in the first place was to try to get rid of the Palestinians. And so in 1967, a new chapter enters in which, although Palestinians are concentrated in the occupied territories and in the north and the south of the Israeli state, they are all under Israeli rule, and they are increasingly integrated into the economy as a cheap labor force, particularly in construction and in agriculture, but also in a number of kind of different blue collar work. And that's particularly strong in the Gaza Strip, where nearly half of the entire labor force was employed in Israel until 1993, until the Oslo Accords brings an end to this process. So there's a huge kind of dependency of these areas on the Israeli economy, as well as this kind of contradiction that I talked about, which is a kind of, after the original attempt at getting rid of the Palestinians, their integration. Now, that integration shouldn't be exaggerated. It's very big in, for example, in construction and agriculture, where nearly half of the workforce is Palestinian in this period. But overall, it represents 7% of the Israeli labor force. So we're not in a kind of a South African or Algerian situation that the labor Zionist theorists were worried about in the 1920s and 30s. But nonetheless, this is a kind of a new situation and a new way of dealing with this contradiction that lies at the heart of the Zionist project. That contradiction is going to explode with the first Intifada. In 1987, there is a large and protracted Palestinian uprising across historic Palestine that lasts until the early 1990s and ends with the Oslo Accords that I assume people will know. But what's important about the Intifada is that one of the reasons that the Intifada is so powerful is because of the Palestinian integration into the Israeli economy. Exactly what labor Zionist policymakers had warned against in the 1920s and 30s is that because the Palestinians are integrated in the Israeli economy, they are able to mobilize, albeit in a kind of smaller way than indigenous populations in Algeria and South Africa had been able to, that position to put pressure on the Israeli state and to demand liberation, better treatment, etc. The Oslo Accords are then going to be a new attempt to deal with that same contradiction. And the Oslo Accords response is basically going to be a middle house between the Nakba response and the 1967 response, which is going to be that Israel is not going to relinquish control over the occupied territories, but that is going to again try to concentrate Palestinians in the urban centers where Palestinians will live under the rule of the Palestinian Authority in these large urban centers, while Israel will remain in control of the land that surrounds those areas. And so the kind of archipelago of Palestine, as you see it here, I think is a very good way to illustrate what that looks like. And in fact, the situation is worse than that, because what you see here is the light green areas are the areas that are directly under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, however theoretical that might be, whereas the dark green areas are on the shared authority, which effectively means that they are on the Israeli Authority as well. But so the Oslo Accords are certainly in part, there's also a regional aspect to it, but in part a way to try to deal with the contradiction that has been reopened after 1967 by making Palestinians in the occupied territories the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, while Israel remains in control of the majority of the land. Gaza is going to be an issue here once again, and famously Yitzhak Rabin, who's the prime minister at the time, who negotiates the Oslo agreements, will say that I wish I could wake up one day and find that Gaza has sunk into the sea, because Gaza is so densely populated that it is very difficult to apply the same logic as on the West Bank. At the time, there are still 8,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip, that ruled over 30% of the land. It's an incredible kind of uh, um, ratio, but of course, making it extremely difficult to protect it, to control, demanding massive amounts of military power to maintain the kind of the defense of those settlements for very little kind of what Israeli policymakers and military officials will see as very little kind of strategic um, outcome or gain. And so in 2005, following the second Intifada, which is the kind of the second large and sustained uprising, which starts in 2000 and ends around 2005, much more military in nature. And of course, it's more military because the Palestinians have been pushed out not entirely, but in very large numbers out of the Israeli economy. And so the kind of the same economic pressure is much harder to exert as well. And importantly, of the fact that Israel followed a strategy of militarizing the conflict much more quickly by opening fire on the early demonstrations of the Second Intifada. I'm not going to go into the Second Intifada, but the decision at the end of that kind of prolonged, much more military conflict is that Ariel Sharon, who's famous in Gaza, known as the Butcher of Khan Yunis, which is in the south of Gaza in 1956, he led Unit 101 into Khan Yunis under the cover of finding the Fedayeen there, but where the unit went house to house and killed hundreds of Palestinians in the town. Ariel Sharon is going to decide, often against his own kind of political camp, that Gaza is not strategically worth it. And so he unilaterally pulls out the settlers and resolves in a new way the same kind of contradiction, which is to say, Gaza is going to remain first and foremost an area in which we concentrate the Palestinians out of the historic land, and there starts the blockade. And I think this is important because we've heard a lot in the last kind of month that the blockade starts with the election of Hamas in 2007, which is inaccurate. The blockade starts in 2005 with the pulling out of the settlers and is intensified from 2007 onwards after the election of Hamas. But so the logic is Gaza is too complicated to hold. It's too small and strategically uninteresting. It's easier to cut it off and hold it behind barbed wires while we focus on the West Bank and East Jerusalem in terms of settlement expansion. And that, in a sense, is the sort of the status quo up until today, which is to say that there's 18 years of blockade in which Israel follows a number of policies that are sort of described and named in almost caricatured kind of horrible ways by Israeli policymakers. So there's a policy of mowing the lawn, which is that every so often Israel responds to the inevitable military response that comes from keeping 2.3 million people in such a small area while limiting the imports of food, medicine, construction materials, making them dependent on Israel for electricity, fuel, etc. All the things that we are seeing mobilized against the Strip now. The policy of mowing the lawn is that it should be lawn and not law. On the slide is to regularly militarily attack the Strip to break the kind of military abilities. So it's never to find a political solution. It is to push back the problem effectively until it explodes on the 7th of October in a way that is much more severe and much more fundamental than it had in the past. The limiting of imports takes a particularly horrible kind of turn with this idea, with the limiting of imports on food. Dov Weisglas, who's the advisor of Ehud Olmert, who's an Israeli prime minister, in the 2000s, famously said that the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet in Gaza, but not to make them die of hunger, which comes with a policy of calculating the amount of calories that are allowed yearly into the Strip. And so really where we get to today is that the contradiction that is the Gaza Strip, and I hope that I've made this clear, is that the Gaza Strip, as we think of it today, is not so much a geographical reality as it is a political outcome of 75 years of a policy that tries to keep Palestinians in an area to avoid, first and foremost, their ability of returning, and to avoid finding a solution that would be an other solution than kind of disappearing the Strip in one way or another in the kind of different ways in which Israeli policymakers imagine and hope for it, and which again I think are being put very starkly in front of our eyes now. And I'll stop there in just a moment. But I think that contradiction is important in understanding what is happening right now, because it is worth asking, beyond the kind of genocidal campaign that Israel is carrying out in the Gaza Strip today, what is the end game? What does the after the assault look like? Now, on the one hand, we know that Israeli politicians have discussed or are discussing, that there's documents that have been published, of expelling the entire population of Gaza to Egypt. And that's this kind of ongoing thing of, could they just disappear? The problem with that, of course, is that Egypt won't accept it, that the Palestinians in Gaza won't leave. They've been there before. They know that leaving means never being allowed to return. And then there are the kind of genocidal desires of Israeli politicians. We had again, was it yesterday or the day before, an Israeli politician talking about nuking the Gaza Strip. It's unclear whether he's being reprimanded more for publicly acknowledging that Israel has a nuclear weapon, or for floating the idea of using it against the Gaza Strip. But of course, he's certainly not the first one. We had Likud politicians talking about bombing the Gaza Strip in similar eliminatory ways. Lots of different talks of clearing the Gaza Strip, of destroying it, of killing its inhabitants, etc. So there is definitely a genocidal drive, which has a certain logic. This idea of like expulsion or full elimination is certainly in that kind of logic of the thing that Israel has created, which we think of today as the Gaza Strip, could be resolved. The contradiction could be resolved in this way. There are, of course, real political consequences to that, whether it's the triggering of a regional war, however much Iran and Hezbollah have made clear that they are not actually prepared for full confrontation. There is a question of where exactly the line lies, if it exists, and how long the Arab regimes can keep their own populations in check in the face of the genocide. The kind of mobilizations we've seen in Egypt, in Jordan, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Tunis, in Morocco, many states that have normalized relations with Israel, that are putting major pressure on those regimes, make both the kind of expulsion or sort of, even larger kind of mass murder than the one that we're seeing now difficult to imagine. At the same time, what are the other options? Would Israel reoccupy the Gaza Strip as it did before 2005, between 1967 and 2005? It's very difficult to imagine. It would put itself back into the position that Ariel Sharon pulled Israel out of, which is a situation of having to oversee directly a population of 2.3 million people, an extremely small, unviable territory, making Israel militarily exposed to operations by the different Palestinian factions in the strips. It's very difficult to imagine that Israel would reoccupy. Would it reimpose the Palestinian Authority? Very difficult to think that that's possible. The Palestinian Authority, first of all, has been clear that it wouldn't participate except if there was a wider political solution for the West Bank and East Jerusalem, so for the whole of the occupied territories, which Israel will certainly be unwilling to even contemplate or to participate in. Nor has the Palestinian Authority much credibility or social base in Gaza or the West Bank for that matter. But in the West Bank, they're already in power and have the police force and the support of the international community to impose that presence. So difficult to imagine that the reimposition of the Palestinian Authority would be an option. That leaves the possibility of allowing Hamas to remain. which I think remains the most likely option, but also is politically very difficult now that the entire reason for the military assault on the population of the Gaza Strip is being justified on the basis of getting rid of Hamas. Very difficult to understand how that could happen. And then you're left with a kind of a fundamental contradiction that I think lies, as I hopefully have showed, in the whole sort of trajectory of the Zionist movement: more land with less Palestinians, and that of course has to deal with the actual people who are unwilling, to relinquish their demands for, in the kind of the slogan of the PLO, for liberation and return. And I think it's that kind of fundamental contradiction that Israel is currently trying to resolve by dropping unimaginable amount of bombs and also kind of troops and tanks by land on the entire infrastructure of Gaza: roads, hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, UNRWA offices, media personnel and their families, people fleeing on routes that are supposed to be safe, etc., etc., etc. But that is not actually a solution to the fundamental contradiction that I've tried to highlight. And I think it's important for the Palestinian solidarity movement, for policymakers, for people who care about the future of the area, of the people of the area, to remain steadfast and committed to the idea that there is only one just possible solution to this contradiction, which is a historical settlement over this question. There can't be justice in Gaza without ending the blockade. There can't be a justice in Gaza without people being allowed to return to their land, without an end to military occupation. And to not do that is to prepare for something much worse than the 7th of October. Because if we think about the fact that the people who participated in the operations on the 7th of October were people that would have survived the, at the time, unthinkable assault of 2014, the generation that will come after this attack will have gone to much worse, much more unspeakable horrors, both in the current genocidal assault and in the aftermath, whatever that might look like. And so that is just preparing for another round of worse and more terrible and more unspeakable, that can only be resolved by resolving the contradiction that I've tried to highlight once and for all. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sai, for this very comprehensive lecture and for giving us such a detailed context that was so much needed. I'll say we can open the floor for questions. People feel free to write your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask the questions yourself. I can start with a question to just start the conversation again. We're just thinking there's a lot of people are also speculating the idea of occupying Gaza, the idea of expulsing people, Palestinians from Gaza, is also part of maybe Israel's wider plan to make that part of Israel. I wonder if this might have some truth to it, or what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess that's kind of where I was trying to go at the end, which is I think that's undoubtedly a desire amongst Israeli policymakers, much as there is undoubtedly a desire to push Palestinians in the West Bank into Jordan. It is published, it is written about, it is spoken about. Israeli policymakers couldn't be more transparent about those desires. I do think we have to acknowledge that there is a big gap between desires and reality, which is that, first of all, I think neither Jordan nor Egypt would be prepared, not even for progressive reasons, for fairly reactionary reasons of not wanting to have to deal with more Palestinians. I have to say, I think there's real questions about whether the United States would be willing to allow such an option. The Sinai is a key strategic point. It is right next to the Suez Canal. There is already a massive problem of different armed organizations fighting the Egyptian state and international peacekeeping organizations in the Sinai, and really important kind of illicit trade routes that go through the area. Adding 2 million, 2.3 million Palestinian refugees into the area who are desiring of being able to return and to take on their occupiers. I find it difficult to imagine that the United States think this is a good idea at the side of what is the most important thoroughfare of world trade. And importantly, and not to kind of disappear them in the discussion, I also think it's pretty clear that Palestinians won't go. Now, is the current strategy that Israel is pursuing to make the Gaza Strip so unlivable, so impossible to rebuild after the kind of unspeakable levels of violence that are being and destruction that are being rained down on the Strip? That might very well be the case. But again, what that necessitates is a broader kind of infrastructure that could somehow integrate the Palestinians somewhere else, and that the Palestinians themselves would be prepared to move. And I think both of those remain extremely unlikely. So however much Israel might wish that, I find it very difficult. And I think this is part of the kind of the bloodletting, is that part of the bloodletting is that there is actually very little else that Israel has in its political arsenal right now than just carrying out unspeakable violence in order to be able to kind of reassert its authority, to punish the Palestinians, to remind them of who's boss, to calm the Israeli public opinion, etc. But in terms of a political opinion, I think that's extreme. A political solution. I have to say I don't see it. I'm a little bit nervous because I also think that what we're seeing for the moment is so unthinkable that there are also moments in history where things that seem impossible become possible, either in the very good or in this case in the very bad. So, I might be terribly wrong, but my assumption is that that's not something that's actually possible for the Israelis.
There is a question in the chat from Dana. So can you say a bit more about the Fatah-Hamas split and public opinion in the Gaza Strip about the future of Gaza and Palestine?
I think there's two things to say about it. One is, of course, that split is very real and very important and has been for a long time. And in fact, that I think the reality is probably that Fatah lost its popular support in the whole of the occupied territory. So I think that's something that's important to remember, is that Hamas won the only democratic election that took place in the occupied territories in 2006. And that after it won, Israel, the international community, the United States, the European Union, all supported the coup that Fatah operated when it took control over the West Bank again after losing the elections. So I think that's the first thing to say, which is that there's a very long-term collapse of primarily, I think, a support for Fatah that comes from its participation in the Oslo process, the fact that it has accepted to become a kind of a police force for the occupation, arresting, torturing Palestinian political activists, murdering them at times, certainly repressing in ways that are, if not the same, but participate in the kind of general infrastructure, and a total inability to offer a kind of a political solution. So in that context, and I think that's the most important context, Hamas is elected in 2006 as the only alternative that proposes an ongoing resistance to Israel. Now, where that lies today, I think, is difficult to say. There are no elections. And it's really important, I think, to say there's a very good podcast with Tarek Bakoni, who wrote a wonderful book called Hamas Contained. Perhaps he'd be somebody, I mean, he's very busy, but, he's the director or the president of Shabaka. and has done a great podcast with the Dig, where he talks about the fact that it's really important to reassert the fact that elections are not just held in Gaza, that if elections were to be held, they would have to be held for the Palestinian Authority, and that the primary break to elections for the Palestinian Authority is the existing Palestinian Authority. And I think actually the Israelis and the international community, who know very well that if there are elections tomorrow, the chances of basically anybody but Fatah winning are extremely large. One of the things I think that has happened now as well is that fissures were starting to develop much more visibly in Gaza over the last few months. There were very big demonstrations targeted at Hamas that talked about not only the fact that, of course, the situation is unlivable in the Gaza Strip because of the occupation and the blockade, but also because of the mismanagement of the strip by Hamas itself. I think those contradictions have disappeared right now. I think one of the things, and that always is the case when colonial states wage these kind of terrible, bloody wars against guerrilla movements, is that they make them more popular. And I think we have to work from the logic that every day that this massacre continues, every single military organization in Gaza, and the Qassam brigades first and foremost, will become more popular and will be recruiting more people who at this point will be prepared to do anything to stop what they're seeing in front of their eyes. So I think a lot of those contradictions that were coming out in the open over the summer will have been crushed along with everything else in Gaza over the.
Then I will read the question in the chat. So thank you for the insightful lecture. Could you expand a bit on the notion of the Jewish labor in relation to the underpaid blue-collar Palestinian workers, as well as the recent news of Israel wanting to collaborate with India to recruit Indian workers for the construction industry after revoking thousands of Palestinian work permits after October 7? An important aspect post-conflict will surely be the economic sustainability of the Palestinians.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. So what I should say is that one of the things that happens in Oslo, which I didn't mention, is that a part of the Giorgio, you're unmuted. If you could mute yourself, that'd be really kind of you. Thank you. I think that part of what so what happens in the Oslo period is that Israel tries to relieve itself of its dependence on Palestinian labor, and it does so by turning to a sort of Gulf monarchy model. So it brings in tens of thousands of migrant workers from Romania, from China, from Turkey, from Indonesia, from Thailand. The Israeli agricultural sector is still highly dependent on Thai workers. In fact, Thai workers were amongst the people who were killed and taken hostage on the 7th of October because they work in the agricultural industries of the kibbutzim around Gaza. And that is the solution that Israel follows to this kind of problem. So it's to say that actually the Palestinians can be replaced by migrant workers. The problem is that leads to other difficulties. And so the military and the security establishment in Israel is deeply opposed to this process of replacing Palestinians with migrant workers. And it's opposed to it for two reasons. One, because it cuts a really important flood of money into the occupied territories, and therefore increases the restlessness in the occupied territory. So by losing access to the labor market in Israel, people have less work, people are poorer, even people who didn't work in Israel had family members who worked in Israel who were able to bring money back. That money stops, and so it increases the contradictions inside of the occupied territories and makes the occupied territories more restless. So the military is very in favor of increasing work permits to calm the situation. In fact, before the 7th of October, there was a real push again by military officials over the last kind of, not so much in the last government, but the government before the latest, the current Netanyahu government, increased work permits also from Gaza for the first time since a very long time, in order to try to do the same thing, to use the money to kind of work as a political stabilizer. The second reason is because the work permit serves as an important disciplining tool. People go through security checks to receive work permits, and that includes being a member of a political party, of a trade union, but also to have a family member who is accused of terrorism, which obviously is an extremely vague and widely used category by Israel amongst Palestinians. And so it also serves as a political control tool, because if you want to have access to the labor market, you have to abandon the national demands of the Palestinian movement. No worry at all, Giorgio. Please don't worry. Right now, the argument is becoming, so people will have seen perhaps that there was a video of the head of the Israeli Builders Association that said that they have entered in negotiations and made a demand to the Indian government to bring over between 80 and 100,000 workers to replace the Palestinian workers, including those of the West Bank, in the construction industry. So one of the things that came out of the Second Intifada was actually a return to Palestinian labor. In fact, I have an article that came out very recently about exactly that question, and that I think is probably immediately no longer accurate because of these developments now, which it seems that the demand is a return to the Oslo period. Again, Israel is going to walk into a contradiction that it can't resolve. Sure, in the short term, it can say no longer is there access for Palestinian workers to our labor market. The question then is, well, what are you going to do with the Palestinians that live under your rule? And that's the problem since 1967, is that in everything but name, the entire area of historic Palestine is Israel. Israel rules over all of it and has to administer the whole of it. So what will it do with the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza and the 3.5 million Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank? Well, I should say in the West Bank, because in East Jerusalem is a different labor system. But if it cuts them completely from the Israeli labor market, it will have to deal again with the kind of the same problems of revolt and restlessness, etc., which led it to reverse its policy in the first place. And so we're back to exactly the same problem of kind of fundamental contradictions in Israel's rule of the Palestinians that I'm not convinced it has a solution to outside of its kind of dreams of full elimination. Giorgio, now's your time.
Sorry for my technical confusion. Thank you very much for this really interesting talk with all this historical depth. That was really helpful. But I would have a question. You said, in a way, the unthinkable is the thinkable thinkable. And I was also always the opinion that the way forward, inspired by, for instance, the South African experience, would be the one-state solution. So in a way, to find a way forward in the sense to live together, even accepting that it has a settler-colonialism past. Do you think that's completely unrealistic by now? That's a fantasy dream of an old lefty, or that's not clear to me any longer? Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I think a very important one. The short answer is, I think, no, I don't think it's an unrealistic dream. I think it's the only thing that stands between the present and nightmare, to be perfectly honest. And I think there is a kind of a language that says, oh, it's ridiculous and it's kind of unrealistic, etc. I think what's important to start with is that the one state is a reality. So the question is actually not, should there or shouldn't there be one state? There is one state. There has been one state since 1967 in everything but name, and it is an apartheid state. And so I think the question really in terms of the present is, should that state be an apartheid state, or should it be a democratic state for all of its citizens? And I think when we put it like that, and I think it's important to put it like that, I have a great map, in fact, that I think I can show, which is a map that I received from the Israeli Tourism Office in 2015. And Israel doesn't use it anymore because they use Google now, Google Maps, which is a nice way to avoid sort of having to present things politically oneself, because let me answer the question first, and I'll try to find it, which is a map where Israel represents itself, and it's very clearly a one state, is a state from the river to the sea. There is no West Bank. There are highways that run between Israel proper and the West Bank. The settlements are indicated on the map in exactly the same way as cities. For Israeli citizens, there is one state without borders, while for Palestinians in the occupied territories, there are 1,000,001 borders between all the different kind of islands that I've shown. I think if we start thinking about it in this way, we start saying there is a state, and the question is that it should be democratized. Now, that then asks obviously the bigger question of like, well, how can it be democratized? And here I think is the kind of the problem that the Palestinian left already dealt with in the 1960s and 70s, and which I think remains absolutely accurate. Doesn't mean that it's around the corner, but I think it remains accurate, which is to say that the logic of Zionism was always a regional one. Is that Zionism was appealing to European and then North American powers because of the importance of the region, everything I started with. And so that the reason that our governments today and the United States at its head are willing to continue to not only support, but arm and protect Israel while it carries out a genocide in Gaza is because of its geopolitical interests in the region. And so what the Palestinian left in the 70s always said, and in the 60s, was that and in fact, most of the PLO until the kind of late 70s or early 80s, was that the solution in Palestine would always be a regional one, was that the only moment that it would be possible to establish a different reality in historic Palestine was the moment when Zionism would become more of a liability than an asset for its imperial backers in the West. And I think that remains true. And in fact, I think in that sense, the kind of last decade and the current moment are also important. So if you think about the revolutions in the Middle East in 2011, the question of Palestine was central to all of these uprisings. Everywhere, people made their own liberation always one that was connected to the liberation of the Palestinians. The scenes of, millions of Egyptians in Tahrir Square chanting, in our millions, here we come to Jerusalem, stopping the gas exports by blowing up the pipelines, kicking out the Israeli ambassador. I mean, it's similar scenes, but like people made the connection between their own oppression and that of the Palestinians. And I think at that moment, and of course that was crushed in horrible and bloody ways from 2013 onwards across the region, but you could see what that meant in practice, which was that successful movements for the democratization of the region would put real problems at the feet of the European and North American powers, which would be to say, if we are to remain in diplomatic connection and relation with these actually democratic and liberated states in the region, we won't be able to simply continue the same policy as before, and the kind of blank check signed to Israel would become a real problem. Now, that moment was crushed, but I think it put on the table the possibility of what the regional kind of process would look like. I think we're getting in a much more horrible and less, kind of celebratory way, a taste of that again now, which is that in the face of this massacre, one of the reasons I think that the Arab regimes are sort of, even if very weakly, condemning what's happening, and the Jordanians are canceling meetings with the Hashemites of all people, really the kind of the bottom of the rotten barrel of the regimes in the region are standing up to the Americans, says something about the incredible popular pressure that they feel from below, and that I think will put real limitations. And that's kind of what I was saying about the Egyptian option as well, on both their own rulers and on imperialist rulers. But again, put forward this question of like, at what point does Zionism become, or the support for Israel become, a strategic price rather than a strategic asset for the United States? And at that point, I think it becomes possible to talk about the democratization of the state that already exists between the river and the sea. Sorry, that was a long answer, but yeah, that would be how I
think, unless there are any more questions, we can, close the session, if that's okay for everyone. Thank you so much for this really interesting presentation and very detailed historical account. It was really what we are hoping to convey through this lecture series. And thank you also for making it happen in such a short notice. And we appreciate your support and your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of you for organizing and for having me. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.